It's very nice to have you today. I appreciate you so much tuning in and taking the time out of your day to share it with us. I'm going to read just a little bit, probably about 2 or 3 poems from the book, The Skin of Meaning, which came out from Red Hen Press in April of 2020. I was getting ready to do 88 shows from Santa Monica to Boston and a month in the UK, and they were quickly canceled and pushed online in March of 20. And so we've been trying to put this together for ever since that time. I'm going to read a little bit from The Skin of Meaning, and then Charter will come on, and we're going to spend about 30 minutes talking about the collaborative project, Prosperity Gospel, Portraits of the Great Recession. The first thing I'm going to read is called Portrait of the Artist as a Spark. I had the unfortunate, almost a calamity, but not quite. New Year's, I was burned pretty badly, trying to put a little gas on a fire outside in the middle of a party, and caught my leg on fire. And that subsequently became the motif for several poems in The Skin of Meaning. And this is one of them. Sometimes they say you have to suffer for your art. In this particular instance, I did so literally. This is called Portrait of the Artist as a Spark. Between the gas and the can, my lower leg disappeared in a blue and orange flame. Nothing is more articulate than fire. It moves in slow motion at the speed of light, a ragged language, raw and messy, that leaves a shattered chugging trail of shadow and debris, the charred coals of a formerly living thing. Fire never mutters. It barks with surprise, then shrieks and tears apart the precision of speech and leaves a soiled scar of broken sentences. Impaled on a spit, clarity returned to me in a burst. 35 years ago, what hung a flaming necktie around my tender brain and begged through the spindle of my body for some sudden flash of truth. Fire filled my veins. Poetry pulled me out by the roots. I had the good fortune to share a plane ride from Chicago to New York with the very influential jazz drummer named Paul Motion. This poem probably almost exactly entails my memory, such as it is, of that encounter. And some of the ideas that we talked about on that day, I've thought about for almost 25 years. This is called Like a Buddha, Paul Motion says. When Paul Motion played drums, he seemed hardly there. A swish, a stir, and then with the whimsy of a ghost slowly rising from the vent, several frozen colors came splashing rapidly down, like flushed birds in the distance. It's the sound an exploding dandelion might make if it were made of tin, when all else stopped and silence strained at its bit, listening for him. I support the band, he asserted. I am an accompanist. I'm there to make it happen, not to linger. Like when I made Monk twirl, he said, swirling his finger and stirring the air. What else is there? He shrugs, plays with his teeth. I know that a far greater country exists, he asserts. I've set my foot down on it. Many rhythms occurring all at once, layers of strings. His eyebrows sting and sharpen. Why ask? He is restful and folds his hands one inside the other. There are perfectly good explanations for the simultaneous risks we juggle. There are shipyards of baubles and harbors that have dried up, and martinis made up by Episcopalians that burnish them for the plagiarisms of the Holy Spirit. It's only right that the room is furnished with importance and low light. You got to flaunt the groove with flourishes and gentle force, I guess. Right, Paul? You got to play like a Buddha, Paul Motion says. I'm going to read one more poem from The Skin of Meaning, and then Charter Weeks is going to join me, and we're going to talk about prosperity gospel. This poem is called Blue Mountain Panorama. I think I'll sing a little blues to get us in the mood, if you don't mind. Just to help lend a little spirit to our proceedings. One of these days, and it won't be long, you look for me, Lord, and I'll be gone. I should have quit you, baby, a long time ago now. I should have quit you, baby. Whoa, whoa, a long time ago. I craned my head and I listened hard. The blues were speaking. And 2,500 feet up Mount Ararat, I was riding the Lincoln Highway where the homespun Allegheny Mountains meet the nonlinear patchwork knobs of the spent Pennsylvania Appalachia. German, Dutch, and Amish squares are interrupted by the chess pieces of church spires. Silent, giant windmills spread across the bald ridges, like trees without their gown of leaves, spinning their mantis arms to catch the flow that fuels the towns. I remember dragging planks up to the thick midsection of the old Fraser pine, and I built a 5-story landing that allowed me to watch the world unroll down the valley and piling hardened cow dung clods for games of war in the rotting barn. Barbed wire caught my sister once, biting her wrist to the bone, and I knew that the blues had spoken. The dirt roads were sprayed with oil to keep the dust down. The naked gourds were broken during pumpkin season, and a juvenile coon riveted a softball-sized ornament on his snout. So eager was he to get at the sweet meat. So much peace, it seems. But since the sun went dim, nothing keeps the gold plague from approaching, and the blues have spoken. The deer population has exploded, and the resulting collisions and with motorists have strewn corpses all along the road's shoulders. Lazy buzzards ride the wind thermals and circle like fixed gray drones. And inside Tuscarora Mountain, the tunnels are sheer behind the neighboring cliffs, and its inhabitants conduct their unseen commerce, coiled tight as a nautilus, and their hidden industry enables the rise of the chattering countryside. Their children get the honey, and the rest have grown pallid with violet lips, and they gather together by the river to hear the governor give the news. The blues have spoken, he tells them. And in Newville, where the heart of the Cumberland Valley has begun to fray, the police produce improved tasers, and they practice on targets that bear our likeness. And in this spreading world, the mountain removal has begun, just a little off the top, say the banker's sons, and distant wisps grow into solid, smoldering columns of mellifluous destruction, where the last languid strains of smoke have broken loose, and the blues have spoken. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and for listening. I'm going to be joined now by Charter Weeks. He and I have collaborated on a book entitled Prosperity Gospel, Portraits of the Great Recession. And we want to talk about that for the next half hour or so, and then we're going to take questions. Charter approached me, and we worked on this book for about 8 or 9 years. And Charter approached me about this book, I think, and I'll have him talk more about that. And we decided that what we wanted to do was to talk about how the recession of 2008 had affected the people of this area. In particular, folks within about 100 to 200 mile radius of Asheville. We conducted probably 100, 150 interviews, what some folks call kamikaze interviews, where Charter and I would roll up to them and we would speak. We never really ever ran into anybody that wasn't willing to speak to us about their experience. And fortunately, Charter was able to get some astounding photographs of these folks. We wanted not to just, one of the things that we posited was the fact that we didn't believe that the recession ended in the late 2009 that the government asserted. And we hoped that we were able to let everyone tell their story with some dignity. And we wanted to talk to people from all aspects of the community. Not just folks that were having a hard time, because no one was unaffected by the recession. Everybody was affected. And the book is broken into 4 sections. It's called, there's Profiles of the Working Poor, Working Around It, One Crisis from Catastrophe, and Where the Money Goes. And once upon a time, it was probably an oxymoron to say that there were working poor in this country. Had never been a phrase that people talked about a lot, but it is now. And the gap between the haves and have-nots is greater in this country than at any other time in our history. And we believe that the recession has continued to the present day, exacerbated clearly by the pandemic, but what has happened is the basic structure has changed. And I'll let Charter speak a little bit to this. This is Charter Weeks.
You on?
Yeah, can
You're
you hear?
on, go ahead.
Go ahead, Charter.
I think they're going to put the picture up.
We can see you.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. Well, Keith and I did this project in part because we really did understand that the basic structure of the economy after 2008 had frankly been resolved for so many of the main players in this, the people responsible for it. There were, am I muted?
No.
Okay. That the banks were made whole, the insurance companies were made whole, the car companies were made whole, but and these were widely covered in the mainstream press, but nobody has really talked very much about the effects on individuals. And so when Keith and I got together here in 2011, when I was visiting family, we had a conversation about the necessity to do this because we thought it was important for there to be a historical record of what really actually happened. And so we began, I came here a day after Christmas in 2011, and we started this process. And I think Keith began to say, well, I'll help the old man out a little bit here, but it didn't take very long for him to say, oh, this is a fantastic, interesting story. And so we've become best friends, of course. And we think that this project has an important historical place because nothing else like it exists. We also didn't want to focus on the kind of endemic notion of poverty that has so long been attributed to this area. We wanted to make sure it was simply about the recession itself. And so we tried to make that the focus. I would like to say also that because I lived at the time in New Hampshire, I thought it was important to also take a look at these events in the other end of the Appalachian chain. And I went with a writer to Berlin, New Hampshire, a failed mill town, and did exactly the same thing. And so, lest one thinks that it's just here in Appalachia that this occurred, it certainly is not. It's all over the country, and that's important to know that we did not. This story is a nationwide story, and as Keith said, it continues to exist today.
Well, the feeling is, there's an enormous disconnect between Main Street and Wall Street. We seem to judge the quality of our economy by the way the Dow goes up and down, and as a consequence, what happens is there's Main Street suffers from that comparison. Wall Street, about 67 to 75% of Wall Street is actually owned by a handful of individuals who are doing the actual betting and vetting. And as a consequence, the general problems of folks who are trying to make a living, who are trying to get childcare, who are trying to figure out how to work a job, sometimes 2 jobs or 3, as the disconnect happens. And we wanted these stories to be front and center in people's consciousness. We didn't want these faces to remain invisible to their countrymen. And it's important that everybody be treated with dignity and everybody have a dignified response to the things that they're going through. One of the statistics, I did a great deal of research for this book. Charter talked about it in the beginning, and I did feel like in the beginning I was there to augment and just support Charter's project. I thought this was a photography project, and I wanted to help in any way I could. But then this became sort of a love letter to the region for me. I'm a longtime native. I grew up in Madison County. I actually gave one of the 2 or 3 first poetry readings that was ever given at Malaprops when I was like 20 years old, 21 years old. I've been here for a long time. I'm writing a novel right now that we'll talk more about that, but this feels like my love letter to the region. And the more involved that we became, the more this became a true collaboration between Charter and myself. Charter is a genius photographer. You should come for the price of the book just for his photographs alone. But there's a tremendous amount of storytelling and research that went into this book as well. And one of the things I think we talk about too is that we talk about poverty in terms of minimum wage. And right now, there's not a single county in the United States where a single person working a minimum wage job can pay the rent on an apartment, not a one. Also, there is about 40% of Americans who don't have $400 in the bank in the event of an emergency. In other words, if they had an emergency that cost them more than $400, they have no way to handle it or to find someone to help them. These are unprecedented circumstances in our country now. Also, with the pandemic, rural hospitals are going out of business and are overwhelmed with what's happening to them. And 66% of bankruptcies in this country are caused by medical catastrophes. So that previously successful people who were paying a mortgage, who owned the property, could be caught up in the tsunami of a single catastrophic medical event and lose everything that they have and find themselves at the mercy of the elements. And some of these stories are actually quite well specifically documented in this book.
For example, there was a 1099 carpenter whose story is in our book. He's a homeless person here living along the French Broad River. he fell off his ladder when he was working on his own home and ended up in the hospital for 3 months. Those kinds of stories are endemic to poverty and particularly to homelessness. It becomes extremely difficult to recover once you've lost everything. And for many people in our book, you'll see that that's quite true. Also, we actually the book has some very interesting stories about people who succeeded in this process. There's a gentleman who was a construction company, and he had a lot of equipment, and he owned it all himself. And so while the other people went down, he actually got more and more business. Person who owned a used clothing store opened another store. So they're both sides of the coin in this book. And as Keith suggested, I guess I would like to say that I think that somehow or other, the people in this book represent the kind of people who gave up on politics. And frankly, I think these are the people, many of these people are the people who voted for Trump because they were desperate to have some new set of circumstances. And I think that these individual stories reflect greatly on what we've seen happen over the last year and a half or two.
Well, that's exactly true, and I think it's also important that we talk about Newt Smith, who used to teach at Western Carolina, and he did a poverty study for Jim Hunt in the early 90s that produced a report. And I talked to Newt when we first started this project, and one of the things that he said to me is, he said, don't forget the success stories. He goes, there's going to be people, just like the Chinese parable says, in all crisis, there's opportunity. And many people, when we talk about the section of the book that work around it, lots of folks took a chance on things that they hadn't done prior. That's one of the reasons that you saw so many breweries come into formation, because lots of folks thought that they could do that as well. There's lots of talents or projects that people loved that they thought were hobbies in their life that became a necessity in their life once they had to figure out another way to make money. And so Newt told me that it was very important that we didn't forget those people, and we tried our best to find them as well. We ended up with about 100 roughly vignettes, and there's a lot of environmental photography in this book as well that tries to tell the story of what happened. One of the places that we ventured into first, I want to do a shout out here to many of you who are local will remember, and the beloved community and Reverend Amy Cantrell. She was every place that we went, we talked to folks who were that were homeless or were living on the street, mentioned Reverend Amy over and over and over to us until eventually we found her, and we did actually a fundraiser for them, beloved community, at the Dinah Wortham Theater. But we found that over and over and over again, they went into the street and tried to help people in ways that were surprising and inventive. And they've grown so much in the 10 years since. It's amazing. If there's a charity that you want to support that's doing fantastic work in our community, the beloved community is that charity. So one of the places that we went was the old Ice House down in the River Arch District. I also interviewed Karen Craignolan, who started the River Link, and I think the Ice House, which had walls that were 2 and 3 feet thick, Charter and I had to tiptoe our way across these gang planks. A lot of the wood for the floors had been taken up by homeless folks who had used it to burn for fuel to keep themselves warm. We went up about 3 stories on this rickety little set of stairs in the dark. And when we got on the 3rd floor, we realized when we were standing in that room, it was completely dark. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And I turned around to Charter and I said, we're completely surrounded. I could feel energy of bodies all around us. And when I shined a flashlight back through the room, there had to have been, what do you think, Charter, 100, 150 people spread in all kinds of disparate ways in the dark, not too happy about us being there. And we shined a light on the walls, and we began to understand that there was so many people in that room in the dark, it was amazing to us. There was a murder that happened a day or two after Charter and I were there, and the city tore the ice house down after that, and that was a really safe place. I say that even in lieu of the murder, at least it allowed people to get out of the cold. And many of them went across the French Broad River and formed a camp. But the fire department went over there with hoses and washed them out. Occupy Wall Street was in full bloom when we first started this project. And one of the ways that chambers of commerce across the country killed that movement was by not allowing people to camp within the city limits of many of the places where these folks were protesting. And that forced them into some disparate places. And as a consequence, that sort of killed that movement in a whole lot of places, particularly rural areas. One of the folks that I spoke to during that, when we went and talked to the Occupy Wall Street folks who were at the Buncombe County Courthouse, and they were all had tents there in front of the steps, was a security guard who was over in front of a Bank of America. For the first time, you went in a lot of these banks that didn't have security before, but now each of them had security guards at the front door. And when I talked to him about what had happened, he said he transferred from Atlanta, and they had taken buses. The city of Atlanta had taken buses in and bussed the homeless folks and the Occupy Wall Street folks out of the places that they'd been camped, and he was all for it. And I thought, he was speaking pretty negatively about the folks that were protesting, and I thought to myself that day that these banks, there were 17 of them when the recession started. That's now down to 9. So the banks that were too big to fail at the time have become even bigger now. Some of them almost twice as big. And I thought to myself then, Bank of America might be too big to fail, but now they've got security guards everywhere. They're not too big to be.
I'd like to return to Keith's notion about the working around it, because there's some very interesting stories in the book, or people in the book. The stories might not be completely covered because the people talked about a lot of things that we just couldn't include. But for example, people found new ways of working. There was a guy and his friend who got a job. I mean, there were very few jobs available, and he got a job clearing 200 acres of land. I was a homesteader, and I've used a chainsaw a whole lot in my life, and I've cut down. They cleared 200 acres of land with a chainsaw. Unbelievable. Many people lost businesses, they lost equipment, and so they had to figure out what to do. There was a trucker who was a long haul trucker, and he had good steady work. And after that, he couldn't get any work, and so he did mechanical work and worked on automobiles and so forth and so on. So there was a person who lost all of his business and opened a store I think in Madison. It was really revealing about the way that people manage their lives in the context of desperation. And again, I think that you'll be fascinated to see, because in a way it's instructive. I mean, I think you will see that if you find yourself in this situation, you're going to have to understand how you're going to manage your life. And these are stories over and over again of people who remanage their lives, reimagine their life. And I'm quite pleased to think that they are an example of how people survive under difficult circumstances.
We also interviewed several folks on the Cherokee Reservation. We spoke to Michelle Hicks, who was then chief of the Eastern Band. We spoke with Barbara Duncan, who was head of the museum for the Cherokee, who had gotten $1 million from Disney to help refurbish the museum. We spoke to the Cherokee elder, Jerry Wolf. We spoke to Davy Arch, who ran the Oconaluftee Village. And it was very interesting to get that perception and to speak to them about how they handled it and the way the government handled them through that really dire time. It was important for us to try to hit this from as many different angles as we could. And I think we have about 7 or 8 minutes more here. I do want to read one piece from the book while we're here. And then what I'd like, we're going to take questions for the last 15 minutes or so, and we welcome your questions as long as you'd like to speak with us. I'm going to read a short thing here. This is by a person that we came in contact with. Her name was Cindy Wessinger. And Cindy, well, I'll just read it. The first time I saw Cindy Wessinger was on a promotional videotape in the offices of the Community Housing Coalition. And she was sitting in a wheelchair in her newly constructed house, thanking the small army of volunteers who'd come from all over the state to build it for her. With tears streaming down her face, her gratitude was clear, and her story was unforgettable. Originally born in Alaska, her family moved to Lexington, South Carolina after an earthquake spooked them, and there a pattern began to form. Sexually abused by her father from infancy, Cindy was kicked out of her home upon this discovery by her mother at age 12, and she was forced to live on the streets. After a string of failed relationships and battles with alcohol and drug abuse, she settled with a man she thought would be a savior to her and her 2 small boys. But a new pattern of abuse began to escalate as her husband became hooked on greater quantities of crystal meth, and then he set up a secret lab to cook it. This scenario exploded into a horrifying incident in which her husband held Cindy and her sons hostage, forced them to play Russian roulette for hours with a loaded gun, eventually throwing one of her sons out of a second-story window, breaking his back, and stabbing Cindy repeatedly with a broken light bulb and cutting her throat with it. He then set the house on fire, took his tractor and turned over their car and left, leaving his family for dead. But Cindy, a survivor for all her life, managed to call 911 and was saved by paramedics. In the video I had seen of her, she was recovering from her injuries and weighed 189 pounds. When Charter and I visited her in her home 6 years later, she is walking on her own, polishing her new motorcycle, and weighed all of 88 pounds. Now, diagnosed with Berger's disease and suffering from cancer, she has jump-started her sewing and alteration business and is trying to find a measure of peace. 36 years since she last saw her father, she tracked him down and forgave him for his treatment of her as a child. She is nurturing a small koi pond in the backyard and trying to keep the local critters from taking them. I always wanted to write a book about my life, she said, but I'm illiterate. She carefully lays out the fabric for the clothes she is working on as she tearfully recounts her story to us. I guess I'm lucky, she says. My boys are healthy, and somebody killed my son of a bitch husband in jail. I get lonely here by myself, but things could always be worse, you know? I think that story speaks so much to the kind of spirit that we encounter time and time again with folks who always, no matter how hard their circumstances were, or how downtrodden they'd been, were willing to share their last hot dog or a Coke with us or whatever they had on hand. Lots of times Charter and I would go to these places and we would take, socks or shoes or hand out a couple of 20s or, bring a little bit of food in and trying to find a way to, allow these folks to speak their minds. I created these little vignettes, which to me are sort of like oral histories. They're kind of like prose poems a little bit, but I think they speak in some ways. They speak to the photographs. And again, like I said, the photography in this is amazing.
The photographs were an interesting experience for me because basically I'm a loner. I don't like to be around other people when I'm shooting, but this of course was a whole different process, and the object of course is to have intimacy, and because Keith was so made people so comfortable, I could work shooting around, you know, the interviews. I mean, basically everybody is looking at Keith because that's for the most part, because he's asking the questions. But, you know, being able to work around, you know, even we were in a very fundamentalist Baptist church, and the preacher said, "Oh, would do anything you want." And so we have they're not all in the book, of course, but I have wonderful images from the very generous way that we were treated at that church, so I think that you know, portrait photography is one thing. This is documentary photography, but it's portrait photography as well, and I think that you often see in people, you know, a kind of a dignity that we'd like to believe that was representative of who they all were. It was for me a really thrilling project as a photographer. I'd also like to add, just for a minute, if I can, Keith's comments about the Cherokee Reservation. I think that that's one of the most progressive reservations, or I'm not even sure it's a reservation anymore, but the place there has done a fabulous job in terms of taking care of its people, and could be an example of what could happen in other Indian communities around the country. So at some point you really should have a look at the book and read the stories about their success stories, which are phenomenal.
Well, Charter has a phrase that he likes to say sometimes, and I want to make sure we get it in here. He says that photography keeps yesterday safe for tomorrow. And I think that's a very interesting way of looking at it. You know, and though this feels like a journalistic enterprise, in some other ways, it also feels like a literary enterprise. It feels like a photographic and graphic enterprise. There's a lot of hyphens that you could use to describe this book. Again, the title is Prosperity Gospel: Portraits of the Great Recession. And one of the things I want to say too is folks don't, you know, you don't get gobsmacked into poverty. Slowly what happens to you is one of each of your possibilities gets taken away one at a time until there are no possibilities or alternatives left for you. And that can happen to anyone. Any person is susceptible to this. And it's important, I think, to see, to visit the institutions and to talk to the folks that provided support for folks. And we've tried to, like I said, we tried to get our arms around all aspects of that. We got, Charter, you have anything else to say before we go to Q&A?
Well, just that, you know, the breadth of that this book covers. We were in gold stores and dirt racetracks and homes and churches and Indian reservations, and we really tried to make, as Keith suggested, you know, the scope of the entire region as best we could. And so I think you'll be interested to see how broadly this book it involves the places that most of you are probably familiar with. Even if you're not from this region, if you're looking at it from another place, you'll begin to understand the characters that are in your community that you've encountered. And I think it's really wonderful that Malaprops has made this available. And we certainly hope that you have an opportunity to stop there and take a look at this book and hopefully purchase it. And I'm not sure, but I believe that they will also ship. So you might want to check in and see whether or not you could buy this book from them directly. But we're very grateful for the opportunity to be here today.
Yeah, I've had a long relationship with Malaprops. I'm very, very happy to share this time with you. And again, please go down there and get yourself a copy of The Skin of Meaning, and also Prosperity Gospel: Portraits of the Great Recession.
I want to thank you so much, Keith and Charter, for that great conversation. And clearly, Keith, you know your way around an evocative reading. So I appreciate that too. And some good singing as well. Let me get to some of the questions that we have. Again, you can post your questions if you have any at in the YouTube chat. We'll get to as many as we can. And let me start off with this question, Keith. The question is, what was unique about the challenges faced by folks in Asheville and the surrounding area as they were affected by the recession versus other areas of Appalachia?
Well, one of the things that I meant to say earlier, Patricia, is that we tried to speak to as many folks. We are in Southern Appalachia, but we spoke to folks in East Tennessee, Eastern Virginia, upstate South Carolina, and really and truly, no one was unaffected by the recession. That's why they call it the Great Recession, because it was so deep and so insidious that I think that what we believe is that this book stands in for almost any community. I know that traditionally the Southern Appalachian region has a history of poverty. For a long period of time, it's one of the regions that when presidents talk about combating poverty, they end up talking about the Appalachian region and the Southern Appalachian. But I'm trying to think of a way to say to you, I don't think it's just endemic here. I feel like that it happened in so many places and was so severe so quickly. It wasn't the kind of thing that we just sort of eroded into. It happened very rapidly, and then once everything crashed, then the recovery, as I think we both believe, has never really taken place.
I'd like to intercede, because I think in part the answer to that question is why I went to Berlin, New Hampshire, to investigate the situation there, which was exactly the same as the situation here, maybe precipitated by other events such as the closing of a major mill. But nonetheless, I wanted to confirm for myself that this was a nationwide story. And if anybody wants to make an inquiry about that specific project, cw@charterweeks.com, you can send me an email, and I could be happy to send you some of the images and text that came from that. It really was a national story. So I think that's what the person wanted to ask about.
Yeah, and one of the things about Asheville in particular, in our area, is there are more artists here than anywhere else. So we have a vibrant artistic renaissance that started taking place in the early 90s. One of the reasons I started the Asheville Poetry Review was that very fact. And so there are a lot of artists here who were affected dramatically because people think buying art is a luxury. Buying books is a luxury. Getting a massage is a luxury. And they don't do those things when times are tough. You know what I mean? But one of the things about artists is we are resilient. And as a consequence, we find other ways to make our living. So I think if there is one particular instance or aspect of it that I could talk about, it's the fact that there are so many artists, open-minded folks in this direct vicinity, that it allowed them to find other ways and other means of not only expressing themselves, but of making a living.
Yeah. Let's have another question.
Another question is, how did you approach Prosperity Gospel as a documentary photographer, Charter? Do you see it as your responsibility to be objective and create a space or a distance between you and the subject? And then that would be the same for Keith as well. Where's the subjective, objective parameter or barrier, or is there one?
It's an interesting problem for anybody who wants to photograph people, of course. I've developed a whole process myself where I figure out how to make people comfortable with who I am and what I'm doing. I've photographed all over the world in strange situations, you can't do something for 50 years and not learn how to do a little bit, I think that people were made comfortable just by the fact of what we were doing and the subject that we were interested in. I think they realized that we cared about them and their story, and so it was really very easy. I probably in every single for every picture in this book, those particular circumstances probably had 30 or 40 images as well. And so we've actually selected the ones that we thought were the most interesting and straightforward. But making people comfortable and even I've done this in China and in Africa and whatnot in a very peculiar way, just by the fact of saying I'm doing this, and people will accept it. It's quite extraordinary, really.
Well, I think it is important to make people comfortable. I think if you show them respect and you show them dignity, then that's going to manifest itself as much as anything else. But I think it was easier for Charter to have objectivity about this because he's not from here necessarily. And I spoke to family members. I spoke to my best friend when I was a kid. I spoke to folks that I know very well and I know personally and have known a long time. And we spoke to tons and tons of complete strangers. But it was important for me, I think, to try to get a bird's eye point of view from folks that were close to me and as well, because everybody suffered. So I think that in that way, Charter had a little bit more of an ability to distance himself from it and in some ways be more artistic. And I had to really position myself in a way to where I made sure that I told the truth. One of the stories, one of my best friends when I was a kid, he had suffered enormously from drug addiction and other things. And his story is just mind-boggling. And when we finished, I took him aside and I said, "Hey, man, your family's going to read this. I'm going to publish what you just said." And he said to me, "Look, man, my life is a cautionary tale. If anybody who has suffered the way I've suffered, if I can help them in any way by what you write, then it's worth it."
I guess I should also say to the person who asked that question is that we'd like to think this is also an art book. I mean, we'd like it to have a vibrancy that is a collaboration, and so we're very excited about the whole project. Next question.
One of the things I was interested in as well to talk about is the connection or the inspiration. One of the things that Prosperity Gospel reminds me of is Studs Terkel's book and his work, and I think that that's so important. Hard times and oral histories of people who were sort of on the margins or kind of considered to be sometimes without a voice or invisible. Did you draw on any inspirations for this unique project, or were there examples of what you wanted to do and maybe things you wanted to avoid?
I think for myself personally, I grew up, I came of age in the 60s, in the time where the images from Vietnam and from the civil rights movement were all over in Look magazine and Life magazine and on the television and whatnot. And that's what sort of set me off on this journey. And I think that this book has been compared by Glenn Ruga from the Social Documentary Network to some of the early work that was done in the 20s and 30s, and particularly around the real Great Recession or the Depression. And that was partly my inspiration, and I think Keith's as well, because we were both familiar with many of the works that came out of that period of time, including Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange and whatnot. Some kind of the power of imagery to tell the story. And as Keith mentioned, we like to say photography keeps yesterday safe for tomorrow, and there are certainly examples of this, from the Depression that are quite moving. So I think for myself personally, those became an inspiration as well.
Well, one of the knee-jerk reactions to the book, and I'm happy to report that there's been a lot of fantastic reviews, but one of the knee-jerk reactions to the book is it immediately gets compared to Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which was a collaboration between James Agee, who is a Knoxville writer, actually grew up there, James Agee and Walker Evans. And so lots of folks, in almost everything that's been written about this book, they've mentioned that book to us. We talked about that a little bit, but this is much different in scope. And one of the things also James Agee did is as a personal witness, it was very important for me to disappear. I didn't need to be talking about myself in these vignettes. I hardly ever would mention Charter or myself in the scenarios, because most of the time the context had nothing to do with our presence. And so this was an event where I needed to be as invisible as I could be and to transparently allow these stories to just move through me. And so I think we both felt that way about it. I think Charter's ability to also make his subjects feel comfortable. A lot of the times when I was talking to folks, sometimes you have to shift gears a little bit in terms of your tone and your diction and your the way you speak to folks. Once I got comfortable and made everyone else comfortable, Charter would just disappear and began to fire away. And so it was very important for us not to be part of the story. And I think we accomplished that.
Keith, could we entertain a question about the skin of meaning? Is that okay?
Be happy to.
Okay. What was it like to write that and then collaborate on Prosperity Gospel, particularly in the context of a pandemic? I presented this as a double header. So what was that experience like for you?
Well, I'm one of those poets. I've been editing the Asheville Poetry Review. We're about to hit our 28th year. And I'm one of those poets who doesn't produce a tremendous amount of work. I'm usually 6 or 7 years between books. So that the writing of The Skin of Meaning and the writing of Prosperity Gospel did overlap. Those books were created in the same space. But they don't really speak to one another in a lot of ways. I tried to read the Blue Mountain Panorama. Felt like to me a transitional poem that spoke to this time in a manner that would transition into our discussion about Prosperity Gospel. But one of the things that I do is I've got 5 book projects going on right now at the same time. I have a novel. I have a book called The History of Rock and Roll. I'm been chosen by the family of Rip Torn. I've been authorized to write his biography. And so I'm doing that right now. And I'm also working on a book of essays on boxing. So one of the things that I may try to do is I have a book file. I don't believe in writer's block. I think it's very important to have as many projects as you can. And I write into one. When I lose my enthusiasm or momentum, I just grab another folder, I open it up and I start writing on there. I do the same thing. When I start to lose my way, then I pull out another folder and I start working on that. And in that manner, I keep the redemptive force of my own imagination engaged, constantly trying to keep it engaged. And this was a welcome project for me. I didn't know that it was going to be as important to my creative development as it turned out to be. And my heart is in both of these books. I think The Skin of Meaning is my best book of poetry. And I don't think there's another book out there that resembles the Prosperity Gospel.
Well, I have to say, I am a hardcore Rip Torn fan. And now we're talking about the Larry Sanders Show, Rip Torn.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Okay,
Absolutely.
so I own the box set of Larry Sanders Show, and I love Rip Torn in that. And so you've got somebody who I feel like this was breaking news tonight at this author event. I can't wait for that, Keith. You have you've got me at Rip Torn. So that is fantastic. I want to thank you and Charter Weeks and our audience, our attentive audience, for joining us this evening. We're delighted to have had such a fantastic and enriching conversation. Thank you for bringing this to us. Tonight we've been in the presence of Keith Flynn and Charter Weeks. They've been discussing Keith Flynn's book, The Skin of Meaning, and he read from that, but then their collaboration is Prosperity Gospel, Portraits of the Great Recession. Thank you so much, everyone. Please take a look at our events calendar to see what other great events like this one are coming up. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time this evening. Everyone be well.